My name is Annabelle Munson. I'm your host and moderator. Okay, so let's get moving. So like I mentioned, a lot to cover. We are going to cover that US CDC testing entry restrictions, the presidential proclamations, all of the above. I'm going to let Adam and Laura from our Global Regulatory Services teams handle that heavy lifting in just a few minutes when they cover what's new for North America ops. I have in fact carved out an entire segment just for them. But before we get to that, I did want to make sure we covered the rest of the world because there is other news to make sure you're keeping abreast of. So Christine's going to handle that for us, and she's going to kick us off as always. We did receive, by the way, a number of inquiries from you on a related note about all the changes happening for North America operations, especially into the US. I did ask Adam to make sure we touched on what we're doing now, the regulatory review and gap analysis process. This may be something you want to take advantage of and go through, but it's going to depend on your operational profile. So I did ask Adam to give us a little more insight into what that looks like so you can decide if that's something you want to follow up on. All right, and then finally, your questions, of course. Like I mentioned, hold on to your US entry and questions if you can until Adam and Laura go through their segment. We may answer it already, and then it gives us more time in the chat to answer everything else. All right, our experts on board with us today, Christine Van Backus with Charter Operations and our COVID guidance expert, Laura Everington and Adam Hartley from our Global Regulatory Services team. I know these are very familiar names for a lot of you, so welcome to all three of you. And like I mentioned, though, we are going to start with Christine to do that global overview. So let me highlight Christine for everyone on the screen. And Christine, welcome. Could you start off with Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean?
Absolutely. So as far as Central America is concerned, things have remained pretty stable. We haven't seen much changes. As far as the Caribbean is concerned, we have seen some expansion of the night curfews throughout the region. And also there are certain islands that are implementing additional quarantines. For example, the St. Vincent and Grenadines is now increasing their quarantine time. They already had one. But for countries, for example, from high-risk areas such as the US, it's now a minimum of 14 days. Also, Barbados, effective February 3rd, is going to start implementing quarantine. So you already require the COVID test, and now upon arrival, you have to go into quarantine for 5 days until you can get another COVID test before being permitted to move about.
Got it. All right. What about South America?
South America is pretty uneventful. Things have remained pretty stable, so nothing to note there.
All right. Well, then we'll move on to Europe. I know there's some things to cover.
So things in the European region have been tightening. We have seen restrictions throughout the region, and that's primarily because of the different COVID variations that are found. You'll find that Portugal is prohibiting flights coming from the UK. France is adding additional requirements from entrants coming from the UK. Also, the UK just announced that entrants coming into the UK from certain high-risk areas, such as South Africa and Portugal, will have to quarantine at specific hotels, but that list has not yet been announced. So we're going to wait and see what happens with that. On a positive note, Iceland is the only country in the world that is permitting persons that are able to get in. The US nationals are still prohibited, but persons that are able to get in, if you have the vaccine, then you can forego the quarantine. So right now, they're the only ones on that list.
Got it. Okay. Well, what about the Middle East and Africa?
So for Africa, things have remained pretty stable. The notable change is Tunisia. They require a 14-day quarantine now. As far as the Middle East, Jordan already required a COVID test prior to entry. Now they also require a test the moment that you arrive. You also have to have health insurance that does cover COVID, and you have to complete a health declaration form. Israel, on the other hand, has an international lockdown through the end of the month. They are also prohibiting passenger flights into and out of the country. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens there. The notable change, it's not COVID related, but that I wanted to mention, is that flights now between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE and Qatar are now possible. So for years, that wasn't a possibility due to the relations between those countries, but that has now changed effective the new year.
Got it. Okay, then let's continue on to Asia Pacific.
The region has been pretty stable since COVID started. The notable change, Philippines rather, is still an extension. They're still banning US nationals from entry, but Sri Lanka has now reopened their borders effective January 21st. So persons that are looking to travel to that country for tourism may go through those avenues of trying to apply for such visa.
All Right. Well, thank you for that quick world tour. But before we go on to the US and Canada update from Adam and Laura, Christine, can you hit on two special events I know people have been asking about, the Olympics in Japan and the World Economic Forum coming up in Singapore?
So for the Olympics, there has been a lot of rumors that it may not take place. The Olympic Committee has adamantly stated that they are still planning on having the games. Of course, we're going to remain what is going to take place. We still haven't received any guidance from civil aviation or anything as pertaining to the slot program. So we're going to wait and see what transpires there. We are keeping a close eye on things with our office out in Tokyo. As far as the World Economic Forum is concerned, it's still slated to take place in May. Civil aviation has yet to announce anything. So with our office out there, we are communicating with civil aviation, and we'll keep you guys updated to any new notices.
Got it. Thank you. And I know we're about to transition over to Adam. And I know on your end, and specifically, when we talked a few days ago, you were engaged specifically with the feasibility project that's happening within the company. That's going to be available coming up the end of this week.
Yes. So in general, when it comes to the possibilities on if a trip can or can't go, if it's feasible, of course, there are a lot of different parameters to consider. And that's anything from the nationality, number of passengers, where you're going to, where you're coming from. So in order to do that, what we've done as a company is to be able to provide you effectively tomorrow with what we call the feasibility guide. So unlike its predecessor with the handling information, the new feasibility guide is in a PDF format. It contains all the previous great information, but in addition to that, it contains all the data that you would need, like COVID, information as it pertains to passports and visas, depending on the nationality for both crew and passengers, and it's searchable. So you can click on the hyperlinks, it'll take you directly to where you need to be. So you can contact your team at any given moment and get that information for your clients.
Got it. Okay, and so that is also going to be included as part of the trips that Universal is facilitating, and then it's available for anyone doing DIY, so they can request it on demand.
Absolutely.
Needed. Okay, cool. All right, so kind of just that same extension of the feasibility theme that we've been on since we started the webinars. All right, good deal. So more tangible resources there. So thank you, Christine. Okay, so as promised, we are going to dig into the details on what's happening in the US and Canada with that update. We're going to go to our global regulatory experts, Adam and Laura. Very good to have you both. Let me get you on spotlight. Great, and we're going to give Christine a breather for the moment. All right, so Adam, I'm about to hand off to you and Laura, but just on this, can you help us out by starting off with Canada? I know that's a briefer update, but I want to make sure we touch on it. And can we get the latest on the COVID restrictions, the presidential proclamations, and then specifically, these are the top 3 topics we've had everyone asking about: defining quarantine requirements, or not, as the case may be, defining active crew and how to treat especially that commercial travel element, and the if my passenger gets sick while I'm abroad question that's also been coming in. Okay, so in your hands, go right ahead.
Awesome. Thank you, Annabelle. Appreciate the opportunity. And really, the way we're going to cover North America is different things. So we're talking about access versus mobility. Can you get in versus what can you do when you're here? Separating a little bit of fact from fiction of what is really regulation and rule right now versus proposal and or guidance. So Laura's going to take us through Canada first, and then we'll walk through the US after that. Laura, give us an update on Canada.
Hi, everybody. It's great seeing so many familiar faces that I haven't seen in so very long. So thank you all for coming. We appreciate the opportunity. As many of you already know, pre-departure COVID-19 testing and negative test results for air travel to Canada has been in place since January 7th. There are some exceptions for certain travelers. Unlike the US, which is a little different, and Adam will cover later, children under 5 years of age are exempt. Active crew member, again, as Annabelle mentioned, there's been many questions about what defines active crew. And in Adam's update, he's going to clarify that for you. But active crew for Canada aligns with what active crew for the US means. Of course, again, exempted is transiting passengers, and then individuals with the essential business. Any essential business to Canada, you can request exemption directly with Transport Canada at any time. I'm quite sure it's cumbersome, but it can be done. So all travelers not exempted going to Canada, regardless of their citizenship, will be required to have proof of the negative test result, of course, at the time of that they arrange entry and clearance through CBSA. The test must be within 72 hours of your departure for Canada, which also aligns to many other countries. Arrivals since the 7th have to be arranged through the individual port with the superintendent. So they process all of the entry and clearance requests and give permission to land. Unlike U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBSA has taken a very active role in the enforcement of these requirements, working closely with Transport Canada and the Ministry of Health. The kicker is, though, anyone arriving Canada, even with proof of a negative PCR test result, must still complete the full mandatory 14-day quarantine. Travelers also must fill out the Arrive Can. It's an application on your phone. It's called Arrive Can, or go to the website to provide contact information and your mandatory 14-day quarantine plan on or before entry. Also, the superintendent will ask you if you've completed that when you're trying to arrange your flight. Providing this contact tracing information allows the government officials to ensure that individuals are compliant. So I'm going to kick it back over to Adam, and he's going to tell you about some of the new and exciting same types of issues with the U.S. Some align, some do not. So thank you again.
Appreciate that, Laura. And that's an important point. So it's the same basic parameters are there in Canada. Kind of everything is live and active right now in the US is kind of halfway there. So let's talk through that a little bit. There was recently a couple of new presidential proclamations saying a few different things. The easiest way to cover this is all previous travel bans, despite the stop-start of it, or the potential that they could go away. All previous travel bans, China, Iran, UK, Ireland, Shenzhen, Brazil, all remain in place. Joining the party will be South Africa as of January 30th. So all those same restrictions are in place for anybody who's been in those suspended regions within the past 14 days. Crew exemptions are still there, obviously, exemptions for American citizens, and other specific situations, special medical needs, those kind of things that we can arrange through a national interest waiver for flights that would be otherwise suspended. So presidential proclamations still hang over us as far as who can access the United States and how they do that. In addition, another mandatory requirement now is PCR testing for all passengers entering the U.S. on air transport. So there was original FAQ that we were covering a few weeks ago. Since then, there's been a couple of updates, the latest being released on the 24th. But the main clarifications were around crew exemptions. So who do they consider be flight crew and exempted flight crew versus, in GA versus test eligibility. So the crew exemptions, we'll cover that really quick, and I'm sure we'll come back and have a couple of different scenarios. But crew exemptions, active flight crew are going to always be exempt. Just regardless of where they've gone to or how long they've been there, they're going to be exempt as active flight crew. Positioning crew, trying to position GA crew on an airline without a COVID test is going to be extremely difficult. You're going to be, regardless of the documentation you can put together to show that you may be in transit to an active flight or something like that, you're really going to be having that discussion with gate agents and people who are trying to board the plane, who are going to be not willing to arbitrate everybody on a case-by-case basis. And so if you are a crew member who's going to have to position on an airline, best practice is absolutely get a negative PCR test result to do that. A couple of things, so that's a couple of things that are out there and were mentioned in one of the presidential proclamations that's really got people stirred up. Two things, quarantine and contact tracing. So what the presidential proclamation previous to the South Africa edition really says, point of that is number one, to show an alignment between the administration, Health and Human Services, CDC, the Department of Homeland Security, and all of these organizations to evaluate both things that are already in place, like travel bans, and now the new PCR testing for their ability to help stop the spread of COVID-19, or if there are any additional measures that should be undertaken by the U.S. government, including potential mandatory quarantine and potential contact tracing, should be reviewed within 14 days of that order, which I believe was on the 21st, with and recommendations made back to the administration to say, should additional measures be put into place on top of presidential proclamations, PCR testing, and the other thing that we saw was a federal requirement for masks when riding on airlines or any air transport that's out there. So kind of fact from fiction of things that are in place in Canada, quarantine and contact tracing, not yet mandatory and in place in the United States, but certainly something that is actively being discussed between the administration and the controlling regulatory bodies. One other common question that we've had a lot of is territories and how they pertain to this. So in the order or in the directive, they define the requirement from flights coming from a foreign country to the United States. The United States is defined as the continental U.S. and all of its territories. So in this example, a flight from the continental U.S. to St. Thomas and back would not require a negative test result for that trip. Before I close out, I'll say that kind of following up on what Christine was saying with the feasibility, so helping identify what's feasible has been a really big focus of Christine and her group and the portfolio teams and TSS as a whole. GRS has really been focused over this past year as regulatory restrictions have come further and further into place, looking at opportunities for operators to gain more flexibility, manage their risk, and use resources. So things like we've talked about ad nauseum, the STEP enrollment program, visa waiver program, all of those things. We'd love the opportunity to talk to you as an operator, 15 minutes or less, to do a regulatory review and gap analysis to make sure you're not missing out on anything out there that could make you either more flexible, manage your risk, or give you more resources when you're out there in uncertain times, for sure. So with that, I will shut up for a second and kick it back to you, Annabelle.
All right, thank you, Adam. So I'm going to now move on. Hold on, I just had
Annabelle,
computer.
I had one
yes.
more. Hey, we forgot one more part of North America.
I'm so excited.
Christine, Hawaii. It's about the special rules in Hawaii.
So for Hawaii, I just wanted to be clear that because we've been getting a lot of questions, can you go to Hawaii without a test? So specifically as it pertains to crew staging there, it really comes down to how long you're going to be there and what you're willing to do. So the requirement for Hawaii, if you want to move about on the larger islands without the appropriate quarantine, is to go through the portal, get the approved vendors that they permit so you can get the COVID testing, get that test, and then fill out that form and submit that information. That would allow you on arrival to move about as you want. However, if you do not want to go ahead and do that, you can just fill out the form and go there and quarantine in place until your departure. So if you left, from here and you were leaving out of Hawaii the next day, you could go quarantine in place at your hotel, get your meals, and then leave the next day. So you can try to get an exemption. There is that possibility, but you would have to reach out to authorities, submit for it, and see if that would be approved. The time frame to get that done is lengthy to just get a response. So it's easier to just either get the test so you can move freely or just quarantine in place as needed.
Got it. Okay, thank you, Christine. All right, so that was an opportune moment there, Adam, because my computer is completely frozen up and I couldn't get to my notes on what was next. So perfect. But also one thing, and I want to thank my team member, Craig, for showcasing this. In my effort to get through my housekeeping items quickly, I forgot to mention something in this format that I have now for Zoom. There is a button up in the the upper right-hand corner that shows your view. And in the case of this, when I'm spotlighting speakers, if you keep yourself in your gallery view, it should work for me to be able to spotlight the speakers for you. So with that said, hopefully that will help you with your spotlight situation. Yes.
I had a couple other notes that I just want to make sure to get out there as well. So one of the other things we've seen in the expanded FAQ from the CDC was talking about test eligibility. And the real easy answer here is it needs to be a result that has been provided by a lab. So whether that's an at-home collection test that you're sending out or you're going to a clinic, it needs to be a lab test. I know there's a lot of cool technology on the testing front that's coming out, but that's where we're starting right now is a lab result. And then document retention. Who needs to keep what? The attestation itself is what needs to be maintained and not the negative test record as far as documentation. And the last part when it comes to documentation is today, this morning, starting at 6 a.m., Universal has begun adding a packet of blank attestation forms to your U.S. Customs deliveries. So if you do U.S. Customs with Universal Weather and Aviation through our GRS team, when we send you that customs confirmation, we will include a packet of attestations that have very simple information on them, that has a passenger name, very simple itinerary that they're associated with, and it's blank so that your PIC, your dispatch, whoever can use as a DIY tool to help fill any gaps you need with this process. So that's helpful, but it is only being included on our U.S. Customs or with our U.S. Customs confirmations at this time.
Got it. All right. Thank you, Adam. Okay. One more thing, I noticed that you guys are appreciating the links that Lewis is busily putting up in the chat. One more, and I didn't get to see it. It was going by so fast, Lewis. If you didn't have an opportunity, that when Adam covered the global regulatory process for doing that regulatory review and gap analysis, if you did not get a chance to, I know we were going quickly. So if you can, I know Lewis is going like crazy in the background there. If you can also put that link up. So if you guys need to get in touch with the global regulatory team, that's your direct channel to them. Okay, so on to kind of the second main event, which are all of your questions. So now is, and I know you guys have already been doing so, but now is a good time since we've gotten through all of our initial segments. If you didn't get your question answered, now please drop it into the chat. I do want to thank everyone that got their questions in advance. So we're going to try to prioritize some of those. But don't forget, we are recording the session in its entirety. So as noted, we're probably going to go over time. And you have to drop off, no worries. You'll get this link in the COVID weekly email that goes out on Thursdays. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Actually, I had a special request and I wanted to, and this came from, again, all the input that you guys give us on what you'd like to see in these sessions. I did drop this in and I want to go ahead drop this in just yesterday with my team, and I want to go ahead and share it with you, a poll, just a quick overview of what you think your outlook may be for international trips coming up. So, and let me get this up on your screen. It should be live for you. If you get a chance to answer this, I'm going to leave it up for just a few seconds, like about 15, 20. You get a chance to answer, that's awesome. And just a way, again, that you can see, and I'll share these results with all of you right now so you can see what the outlook looks like. I know so many factors go into that for you, but all right, I'm gonna go ahead and end that poll. Awesome, thank you for responding. I'm gonna put up the results. We can take a look all together. All right. So sharing the results. So as you can tell, by and large, we've got a lot of people who are still a little bit tentative, but we're in that mid-range, in that 1 to 10 trip range for most of you. So great. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. Okay. Ooh, hold on. Let me press the right button. Then we get back. Okay. All right. So moving on to those questions. So as you can tell, a lot of questions about U.S. restrictions and the what-if scenarios. So Adam, Laura, I know that you did touch on this, but this was specifically, someone brought this up about medevac or the sick passenger situation. One client mentioned that he's been in touch with air ambulance operators recently, since COVID numbers started to rise again, with this specific question, and they were confirming multiple times that they could not transport a COVID positive patient. Can you add to that?
Yeah, I can a little bit. Now there's a difference. So regular medevac flights, Universal just facilitated a trip a couple of days ago for a medevac flight, non-COVID related. All of those, all of the necessary requirements under the Presidential Proclamations, the NIEs or the NIWs through the port, all of that is still required for a typical regular medevac flight. Now, MBAA shared yesterday the new and recently published updated guidance on transporting individuals who have COVID-19 or have been exposed to the virus. The guidance states individuals with COVID-19 are prohibited, as we all know, from traveling on scheduled airline flights. Now, this is information from the CDC, so we may see some changes in the US even after that question came in. Individuals with COVID-19 or exposed persons should use private or medical transport. That's air and ground. So again, we may see some changes since that question was asked. It's going to be a process. Operators are required to notify the CDC no less than 24 hours prior to the flight's departure. The patient obviously has to be evaluated before departure to see the extent of the illness, the severity and level of the medical support necessary for transport, and the list goes on. Not to say we can't do it, but it's going to be a lengthy process. Then, of course, once you have a COVID positive patient on board, you're going to have to deal with all federal, state, and local officials, whether it's in the US or any other country you're transporting them to. All of that still stays in place. If you're planning to transport individuals that test positive for COVID, please read through the newest CDC guidance. MBAA also published it yesterday. I believe that Louis, Annabelle, we have provided a link to that site.
All right, great. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much.
All right. Of course. So thank you. Actually, another question for Adam or Laura. So here's how it's written. Please define whether US-based COVID tests will be accepted by airlines for crews returning from another country to the US, or is a test in the originating country required before departing on the airlines? And I think as we talked about yesterday, is this all sort of my follow-up question, or is this really all about the timing of the tests and the results? That's really what needs to come into play.
Yeah, and I was wondering where we were going with that second part of the question, but really it's about the timing. So we are not doing testing point to point to point as you're moving around. So you may have a quick turn trip or something like that, but the 72-hour time frame prior to departure from the U.S. or 3 days prior to departure from the U.S. or departure to the U.S. Excuse me. And actually, the CDC in their latest FAQ went into that a little bit deeper about why they use the terminology 3 days versus 72 hours, and all of those things, and what would happen if your flight was operationally delayed. If you take a delay and your test is no longer within 3 days, you need to take another test. But the answer to the original question is they should accept a test within 72 hours as long as it's the proper type of test.
All right, and then some clarifying questions, which again, just to be 100% clear for some confusion out there for a few operators. Does the U.S. entry testing requirement apply to business-owned aircraft Part 91 as well as others?
Yeah. So the order is clear, as they were trying to throw as big a net over it as possible. Remember, there's a lot of confusion when this original order came out, and it was just from the UK to the US. And we were left completely, business aviation was not addressed at all, leaving us with a lot of questions. The CDC was very clear in trying to address us as an industry in a variety of different ways, using terms like general aviation, private, charter, all of those things. And then the overall regulation says all travelers on air travel to the US or air transport to the US.
Got it. And while I have you, Adam, I know you touched on this, but just to be 100% clear, the new U.S. government mandate also requires business aviation passengers to wear masks while traveling as they would in any other air travel scenario.
It certainly doesn't exempt us. So it doesn't call us out, but is anybody traveling on air transport to the United States or even domestically within the United States, they're asking to mask up.
Got it. All right. Thanks, Adam. So who's going to be checking out the paperwork when coming back into the U.S.? And the client asked the question, I assume Customs is going to be checking this out when we clear.
Well,
I'll let Laura answer that.
Yeah. So we stay in touch daily with the program manager for general aviation with Customs and Border Protection, obviously here in the U.S. CBP's stance is still that they played no role whatsoever in the implementation, monitoring, or enforcement of all of the latest CDC restrictions and requirements. What does that mean? They're not going to be checking your negative test results. They're not going to be checking your phone. They're not going to be checking any paperwork. Does that mean you don't have to do it? Absolutely not. We still recommend the best practice is to follow CDC guidelines. We're simply saying that Customs and Border Protection, for the purposes of general aviation and unscheduled commercial arrivals, will not be checking your paperwork. Now, within the last day or two, we have had a couple of officers here in the U.S. when we have tried to obtain landing rights that have asked for that information. And of course, they're reading information like everybody else put out by the CDC, and they see that this is a requirement. But after working with headquarters, we have received information that we have been told we can share from Eric Rodriguez with CBP headquarters and Diana Sullivan to share with them that show that CBP absolutely has no role in this. And he also, by the way, just as an aside, wanted us to let our clients know and everybody listening that they are there for your resources as always. I'm quite sure most everybody has their contact information, but if not, we can put it in the chat. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Laura. And then I had another question, once again, about the specifics of those testing requirements. So back to U.S. entry. So how will the U.S. handle kids, or those that are defined in the ruling as defined as those under 2 years old? Is it 2 years and 1 day old then requires a test, or how is it specifically being mandated?
Well, like Laura mentioned, for Canada, the age is 5. For the U.S., it's 2. So once you turn 2, you have turned 2. But anybody over 2 needs a test, 2 or above. Is that inclusive?
That is inclusive. All right. I'm going to give Adam a quick break because he's been talking quite a bit. So Christine, I'm going to pick on you for a minute. We're going to switch gears completely. We have a question from a client about Irish nationals and U.S. nationals entry into Ireland. Any changes?
No, I mean, both U.S. and Irish nationals can enter the country. I think the question is, do you need a quarantine or not? You would for up to 14 days before being able to move around. And also you do need a COVID test prior to entry into the country, but it is possible.
Got it. All right, Christine, we're going to keep on bugging you for a moment. We asked for, one of the clients asked for updates on Surinam, Puerto Rico, and St. Vincent, and then they had a bonus question about Missouri.
Well, first and foremost, as far as Suriname is concerned, U.S. nationals can only travel there if they have an approval from the NCCR. It's the National COVID Team and Civil Aviation. If you get approval on that level, you will be able to enter. You do require COVID testing, and you'll have to quarantine for 7 days. That was just reduced from 14. As far as Puerto Rico, travel is possible. Puerto Rico, of course, is part of the U.S., so you don't have to adhere to the CDC guidelines. However, you do have to adhere to the regulations for Puerto Rico. They do require COVID tests 72 hours prior to arrival. The same would apply for St. Thomas. You don't need those CDC regulations because it's considered domestic, but you adhere to their guidelines to travel there. As far as St. Vincent and Grenadine, I mentioned it earlier, U.S. nationals can enter, but that quarantine time has now increased to 14 days. And as far as Missouri, there are no state mandates, so no quarantine time is needed.
Got it. Okay. Another question for you, Christine. What effect will the recent January 25th Israeli government lockdown on international arrivals at LLBG, have on non-passenger flights, so specifically cargo flights, for example?
So that's really the question here is what type of non-passenger flight is, if it's cargo or if it's a tech stop. If you're looking at a tech stop, you want to obviously look at another location. For a cargo flight, we would have to see based on what the cargo is, if permission would be acceptable from civil aviation. Otherwise, you're going to have to wait until after the 31st of January to see if those restrictions will be lifted, and generally for aircraft going in there.
Got it. And then returning to some more leisure travel destinations, where and what restrictions or requirements on testing are there in the U.S. domestically, especially Aspen, Eagle, other ski and leisure locations?
So just like with Missouri, each state has their own regulations. If there's quarantine or testing required, of course, New York, Mass have different requirements than California. Aspen specifically it's under the Pitkin County. They do require a COVID test prior to entering, and you have to complete a travel affidavit. Also, you need to consider that right now they're in a red zone, so there's very limited services available out there as it pertains to restaurants and services. So you have to go to that state's website to see what the latest are, because they do change from time to time.
All right, good, thank you. And then this one's for any of the three of you, Adam, Laura, or Christine. What if the location does not have testing available that can be accomplished within and results within the time frame that you needed? So Bahamas, outer islands, Turks and Caicos, et cetera. That was the example provided by the client.
We haven't got a lot of real clear guidance yet from the CDC on where somebody might be able to get an exemption or a location that would not, or a list of locations that they've deemed do not have acceptable testing facilities. I know that was mentioned even a few weeks ago. We haven't seen that, and I personally have not seen a waiver process to request an individual waiver for a specific location yet. Christine or Laura, if you guys have seen anything different, let me know. But I haven't picked up a great way to address that yet.
The way I would see it is if you don't have the testing to return to the US, you have to go to a location that would. So even though you may be on the Outer Banks, for example, the Bahamas are smaller locations, you're going to have to travel to one of the larger islands to try to get that testing. And then from there, come back into the US. I know the main island out in Nassau, they do have locations where they can do the antigen test, which is acceptable for entry to the US. So I would try to find a different route where you can get those testing completed.
Got it. Okay. So that brings us, for the time being, to the conclusion of some of our pre-submitted questions. I do have a few I'm going to keep in reserve, mostly because just clarifying what Adam, Christine, and Laura have all gone through, but just to know we'll get back to those if we can, but most of it's already been covered. What I did want to get to is the long list of stuff that's coming in the chat. So Lewis, I know you've been working hard trying to organize those. So what are some of the top questions you're seeing that we can pose to our experts?
Thanks, Annabelle. Laura, Adam, one of the questions we got was regarding the retaining information. So do records of those passenger COVID tests have to be retained for 2 years, not the attestation forms? That's a mouthful.
No, the attestation is what they're after. So you're really after the passenger's declaration that meets the requirement. You're not saving COVID tests, negative COVID tests for. I think that should help alleviate some of the HIPAA concerns that people have. But the requirement is that the traveler has made a declaration to you that they have had a negative COVID test within the required time.
Thanks. Another one about testing. So is it 3 days from the test or 3 days from the results of the test?
It would be 3 days from when you tested, right? So your testing date would be your result within 3 days from that testing date.
Great.
So if they delayed 3 days and didn't give you the results for 3 days or something, that doesn't buy you an extra 3 days.
Thanks. And we kind of already addressed this one in the chat, but just to reiterate, so a vaccine is not an exemption to a test, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So think of this as building blocks, right? So it's a very restrictive thing. First, we're all going to test. We want, the terminology I keep hearing from the CDC is we want everybody to lean in on this testing and doing this because it's all about stop the spread and focus on testing. Then I think as more vaccines roll out or we see other technologies become available or more widely used, you may see some changing or some lightening of those restrictions. But I think they're starting at a very restrictive place on purpose.
Great. We know that the new Presidential Proclamations has added South Africa coming up this weekend. But what about a non-U.S. crew operating an in-registered aircraft entering from the U.S. from South to enter the U.S. from South Africa? Would that be allowed?
Well, sure. A crew-only ferry flight, regardless of crew, are exempt. So Presidential Proclamations, active flight crew are exempt. So and there's no call out for foreign registered versus U.S. registered aircraft or foreign crew versus U.S. crew or anything like that. Flight crew are exempt. The flag of the aircraft doesn't matter.
Thanks. Christine, one for you. What's the latest with Mexico?
As far as Mexico, regulations remain the same going into the country and departing. So you'll need to complete a health form into and out of the country. The one thing to consider is depending on the location you're going to, they do have different zones, colored zones, yellow, orange, and red. So depending on what zone, the location that you're going to, services may be fewer out there, but those are the only requirements.
Thanks, Christine. I'll throw this one out to the group. So are we seeing passengers wanting to be designated as crew members in order to avoid quarantine? And have countries caught on to this? And what is the enforcement?
I don't know if persons have attempted to do that. When you do indicate somebody as a crew member, they will likely have to prove that. It's usually the attire and their crew IDs, either that being a pilot, co-pilot, or a flight attendant. I have personally not seen that, but if one gets caught going that avenue, they could be deported immediately.
Yeah, I mean, this so especially just for the U.S. The criminal penalties can be applied to the operator as well as the traveler themselves. So not a game we would recommend considering.
No, even in Canada, going through all of that information, the individuals themselves, it's 5,000 apiece, and then the operator can be penalized up to 750,000 for deviating from the regulation. So,
Thanks, guys. Laura, some questions regarding Canada. So, if Arrive Can is a passenger responsibility, how are operators supposed to arrange CBSA superintendent approval?
well, so what happens is the information has to be put into the app or on the website prior to that call to CBSA. Then the government officials will go through all of that information and make sure that it's filled out correctly, and give permission for each and every one of those travelers through the app. So it's almost like they're going to be looking at, it's not the same, but it could be, maybe it's somebody looking at API data, APIS information in a system. So when you call CBSA and you're trying to arrange an arrival, they're going to be looking for that information in the app can.
And what I would add to that, Laura, is that CanPass is still playing a role. So when we say you got to engage the superintendent, we're talking a little bit about the mechanics they're going to in the background and who's actually giving those approvals. In Canada, CBSA is customs, whereas in the US, they're not involved. So we're really trying to show that. But your operator would still make their call to CanPass after doing all these things. Like Laura said, CanPass will start the discussion with the superintendent, or in Universal's case, sometimes we'll reach out to the superintendent locally to make them aware of it first if we think it's going to be a complex scenario or there's a lot of passengers and a lot of information to review. But CanPass still plays a role, and they'll help put the operator in touch with the superintendent throughout that coordination process.
Thanks, Adam. Laura, is the Canadian testing requirement 72 hours or 3 days?
For Canada, it specifically says 72 hours. The test must be valid, the test must have been taken 72 hours prior to your departure to Canada, is what it specifically says. So that's one of the regs that has not changed to 3 days as opposed to 72 hours.
Thanks, Laura. Another Canada question. So for Canadian pilots just returned from the US, do they have to complete a full 14-day quarantine before going back on duty and to the US again?
No. Just like with the US, it aligns as well with crew members or active crew members. They are exempt from the requirement.
As long as they're active within their.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Okay. Adam or Laura, just to be clear, if a flight originates from the US, goes to foreign soil, must the passengers obtain NEG COVID test upon reentry to the US?
Not if it's within that time frame.
Correct.
Okay.
And I saw one on here on the chat as well.
Is it pertaining to the crew or the passengers? So if the passengers leave the US, go for business somewhere to a foreign country where they go for business for that day, and then they return, they would not require testing?
If it's within that 72 hours.
If they have a negative PCR test from the US,
Correct.
operate to another country, return within that 3-day period, then they do not have to retest.
Correct. So they either have to get testing before they leave the US and go, or get testing before they enter.
Correct. And to the CDC's point, and we'll just hammer this back home, if the trip delays, even for the most unfortunate circumstances, weather, mechanical, whatever, if it delays and now you're at 4 days, you have to retest. That's just the requirement. The issues that cause the delay are aviation related. The test is virus related, and so they see those as two completely separate things. You can't ask for an exemption based on something that happened operationally or with your aircraft.
Great. Christine, can you tell us the latest on operating into and out of Greece?
So right now, Greece is only permitting EU nationals to come into the country. Of course, within the EU, you can get in there for an EU national, but there are certain countries that may require additional requirements. Like if you're coming from the UK, you have to do testing and adhere to a certain quarantine time. If you're a non-EU national looking to travel there, currently the only possibility is for essential business. For that, you have to get pre-approval through government sources. And it's basically 2 approvals, one for the passenger, one for the aircraft in order to travel there.
Thanks, Christine. So if a crew member, can a crew enter as essential travelers if we're traveling to Iceland and the passenger has been vaccinated?
Could you repeat that question?
So
Christine?
can the crew enter as essential travelers if traveling to Iceland and the passenger has been vaccinated?
Well, right now, US nationals are not normally permitted. You would have to get pre-approval to get into Iceland. But if you are one of the nationalities that is permitted to come into Iceland and have obtained the vaccine, you can forego the quarantine. So usually entrance currently is limited to the EU nationals primarily.
Necesitas.
I'm sorry?
Thanks, Christine. Another test question. So is a rapid test adequate or a home test, or does it have to be a PCR?
For the US?
For the US.
No, it has to be a PCR test. Same for Canada.
Well, for the US, correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, it has to be a viral test, an NAAT, so the PCR falls under that, or an antigen test, which falls in that same category.
Yeah, or the antigen test.
Yeah.
We got a good question on the chat about enforcement again, and we'll just run back through that. So CBP should not be asking for these on arrival into the United States. You should not be offering them on arrival into the United States. That's just going to confuse the issue. But the penal code that they've cited and the criminal penalties would be enforced by the CDC. So the CDC can reach out to a traveler, you know that you've traveled, you're on APIS and those kind of things, and ask them to produce records if they so choose, or reach out to an aircraft operator, big like an airline or small like an operator, and ask them to produce records from their international flights. Remember, no international flights happen in a silo, so they're going to be aware of who traveled and where they traveled and when they traveled, just like with Presidential Proclamations, looking up and identifying foreign nationals on flights coming in the United States and saying they're restricted. They have the same kind of records available. So lean in, because somebody could definitely be watching, and the penalties are pretty strict and severe.
Thanks, Adam. A question again about active crew. What about executive protection? So company employees aboard, would they be considered a crew member?
No. Yeah, that's just no.
Okay.
There's a, well, so I shouldn't just say that. There is a lot of good information about crew members and specific crew members and things that it would make somebody eligible. But even a crew member, so not a security, but even a crew member who would be traveling for training, commuting to or from work for business reasons not associated with the operation of an aircraft, are not exempted from the testing requirement, nor a crew traveling for personal reasons. So number one, a security would not be flight crew and not in operation of the aircraft, so they would absolutely have to test. But the CDC goes into much further detail about crew, and I've seen it on the chat. I would remind or follow up again, putting general aviation crew onto an airline, they should plan to test, period.
Thanks, Adam. Looking forward, as crews get vaccinated, should the vaccination be documented on their yellow vaccination card, or would other documentation be required?
I don't know the answer to that offhand. We'll have to take that one and review it. Unless you have some guidance, Christine.
I don't either.
Not at this time.
Thanks, guys. Laura, a question back to Canada. Has CBSA updated the app to allow for information to be inputted for a tech stop? This individual said the last tech stop they did in Canada, they used the app, but it asked a lot of questions only applicable to overnighting and not a tech stop.
Well, probably because transiting passengers are exempt, as well as obviously the active crew. So I don't know that you would be required to fill anything out to transit through Canada for a tech stop other than the usual CAN pass and working with CBSA on your entry and clearance procedures.
So, and what I would say there as well, and I am not spending a ton of time on the CAN app, so I won't pretend to be a subject matter expert there, but a scheduled tech stop has citizens coming from international travel into the country. The scheduled itinerary has them leaving shortly thereafter. That may not happen, right? For whatever, aircraft mechanical, change in plans, whatever. So I think it's the idea that if somebody's in Canada, they want to prepare themselves that they may have to stay.
Right.
Not because they're quarantined, but because of other situations.
And it was also very clear that that information on the app could or the website could be filled out before or on arrival into Canada. So obviously, if something comes up mechanical wise or illness or whatever, that can be handled once they're there.
Thanks, guys. Another crew question. What about medical crew on board an air ambulance flight?
So we have still got the medical crew national interest waivers. So we support a lot of air ambulance that's not COVID and have been doing national interest waivers, exemptions to make those happen. And we've been requesting national interest exemptions for medical crew, but not for flight crew.
Thanks, Adam. Is there any address on the web where an operator should submit the PACS attestation form?
No, this is the attestation should be maintained within your operation, maintained by the carrier, maintained by the traveler. You do not need to send it in. There's no federal database currently at this time. It's really a disclosure that you're going to be maintaining for potential audit.
Thanks, Adam. Christine, what's the latest in Germany?
As far as Germany, in order for a U.S. person to enter the country, you normally have to get permission from the German police. So you have to fill out their specific form, submit it, and see if they'll permit you. And that's for essential business. However, one caveat for traveling to Germany or some other parts of the European Union, if you travel to Ireland, overnight there, passengers get their stamps from the Irish customs. Then the next leg, the next day, going from Ireland to Germany is considered a domestic leg. Therefore, you would not need to get the approval from the German police. So there are a couple of different ways to get there, depending on what you're needing to do and depending on when you're wanting to do it, of course, if things don't change.
Thanks, Christine. We got a question about quarantine, about Mexico, but I think it's pertinent to any return. These U.S. citizens have to quarantine on return from Mexico if they provide a negative test result.
There is no mandatory testing in the United States, or mandatory quarantine in the United States right now. The CDC guidelines have been out since February, since the first travel ban came out. For anybody who intends to travel internationally should get tested before they go, should get tested upon return, and should self-isolate or quarantine upon their return, and differentiating different times or different periods of time based on whether they test or not or don't test. The CDC has not changed those recommendations with the addition of new testing requirements. They still line still says that you should self-isolate. There is no mandatory regulation saying that is required at this time.
Great, thank you, Adam. And Louis, I know we probably have a few more questions, but I'm just mindful of time. We are at 2 minutes till 1 p.m. Central. We will stay on for a few extra minutes. Definitely if anyone has some last questions, as long as my subject matter experts can stay. But I know some of you clearly, thank you. So many of you have stayed on with us. And like I mentioned, this session is being recorded in its entirety. The link will go out in tomorrow's COVID Ops weekly update via email that you will receive. So please look for the link there. But if you do want to stay with us just a few extra minutes, we can get to a few more questions. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Annabelle. Adam, here's an interesting question. The regulation states that the passenger must produce the test results to a competent authority upon arrival. So there may be other law enforcement that may ask the passenger for the test result, correct?
I have seen that. So I know it's definitely not going to be CBP. I'd have to go back and review the specific part of the guidance to say who they should be or who may request the actual result itself. You know, can somebody else possibly request an attestation that has been filled out? I could see it, but I don't know of anybody requiring to show your actual result on arrival. I don't know who that would be to. But we'll put that on our notes to go back and do a little review.
Thanks. Maybe to summarize it all again, in the simplest terms possible, how does the new requirement affect the 5-day trip to Mexico for PAX and crew?
Give me that one more time. Or
Yeah, say that again, Louis.
So just as simple as you can say, a 5-day trip to Mexico for PAX and crew, how do the new testing requirements impact?
5 days, you're going to be testing in Mexico, so you need to have a good solution there, either through your FBO or have a good plan. So I'd say that's your number one change is you're going to have to be testing in Mexico now. Everything else should run as normal. And also with presidential proclamations, make sure none of those people have been in South Africa in the past few days.
Thanks, Adam. Christine, can you do a recap of New Zealand, Australia, and Asia flying and the current testing requirements for everyone's benefit?
Sure. So the region is in general pretty tied down as far as entry. There were some openings, but because of the different variants, things have shut down. Now, as far as New Zealand, they haven't changed their stance since the beginning. Entrance can only be for residents or permanent residents or citizens, unless they can obtain a specific visa that would permit you to come in. And those visas would either be construction related or they would be for certain types of work that is not available in the country. So I have yet to have any aircraft be able to go in there. As far as Australia is concerned, entry, of course, is restricted, not able to enter. I have seen some exceptions. And in order to do that, you have to contact the Australian government and try to gain a travel exemption. So basically a diplomatic clearance or authorization that the passenger needs to do. If you're approved, then you would get a document outlining exactly what you need to do as far as quarantine, COVID testing, etc. So I've only had one or two be able to do that, and they were for very specific reasons approved by the government. As far as the rest of the APAC region, pretty tied down right now. Sri Lanka is one of the few exceptions that just reopened their borders. You have the Maldives, of course, in the area that is open. Note to self, over the next few days, they have lack of parking. So if you're looking to go out there, you're going to have to find alternate means for parking. But the rest of the region is still locked down. I'm hoping that things change, especially if the Olympics are going to come about, that some agreement on what is and isn't accepted for entry would be put in place.
Thanks, Christine. We got a question about actually the recovery from COVID. So it was in regard to pilots, but I think it would be applicable to anyone. So how does that work, that process, showing that documentation?
Yeah, so for the US, they show that if you have recovered from COVID and potentially could still, this is for passengers, right? So if you've recovered from COVID and for whatever reason are still testing positive, so you still have to test, even if you've recovered from COVID. The easiest way to get over this this blockade or whatever, the easiest way to get over this regulation is take a test. And if you have a negative test, you move forward. If you are not testing negative, as we've heard in the media and some people have probably personally experienced, you could have a positive test result for somewhere months on. So if you are going to want to travel by air and you are still testing positive, you need to pair that positive result, so you still need to take a test, with a medical clearance from a medical professional. So you need to have a doctor who has given you documentation saying that you have recovered from COVID and you are no longer, what do you call it? Contagious.
Thanks, Adam. So we got a question about can Universal provide help with locating a testing facility in a foreign country? And yes, our I'll answer that one. Universal Aviation and our third-party ground handler, we're working to identify PCR testing providers. So if you do have a destination in mind, please work through your TSS team for details, but we are working on that on your behalf.
Hey, Lewis, I think it's important to note, obviously, everybody, we're losing a few people. So I want to make sure we get out there and say, with everything you've heard globally around the world, especially in North America, things are very fluid. They're changing all the time. So, even after we all hang up from this webinar, something could change. So don't take some information from us, even though we spend our days, researching and verifying and re-verifying this information. But always check with your service provider. Give Global Regulatory Services a call. You've got information from the CDC to country officials in individual countries to local people on the ground. And there's a lot of moving parts. So things could change at any time.
Thanks, Laura. And Annabelle, I think that wraps up all the questions. I think we got to everybody.
Awesome. All right. Then I want to thank again all of our subject matter experts, Adam, Laura, Christine. We definitely gave you a workout again today. Thank you so much. And then especially all of you, thank you. I put a note in the chat, but it was just awesome to see so many cameras on and so many faces. We're all just thriving with connections of any kind right now. So definitely appreciate it. And I will go ahead and answer this because I've had so many private messages in the chat. You may not have heard me up front when Greg Evans asked me about the tree. Yes, my tree is clearly still up. I'm calling it an emotional support tree at this point because that's going to help me get through 2021. I joke. I will definitely have it down soon. It'll be a surprise for when we get back together, hopefully in February. So on that note, please look for your invite to our next program. Hope you can make it then as well. Our recording will be out tomorrow with the COVID Ops Weekly Update. Okay, a pleasure having all of you. Take care, and we'll hopefully see each other again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Bye, all.